very often people won't take the risk of drinking their own water. 10% of the worst kind of pollution is coming from wells that no one is responsible for. And because no one is on the hook to deal with it, and even if you try to be a good Samaritan, in some cases, you can get punished for it.
Was it intimidating at all for you to get into that space in a big way and say, well, I'm not going in here to change $1 million industry. I'm actually trying to change a multi-trillion-dollar industry.
Put out my resume to some high schools to teach physics. Went there for a day to interview for high school physics teaching. I had the afternoon free, so I went down to Wall Street and I left New York with 2 investment banking offers and no offers to teach physics.
Just like a walking 4-leaf clover at this point.
Faith is really believing in something that isn't quite there yet.
Welcome back to Money Buys Happiness, guys. Appreciate you guys tuning in. As always, if you guys find value in this episode, make sure you guys hit that like button, leave a comment, let me know what you think of the episode. And of course, last but not least, if you're not subscribed, please subscribe. It means the world. It helps us grow the channel, helps us keep bringing you these valuable episodes. So please subscribe, it means a lot. Love you guys. But let's get into it, okay? You guys know we love bringing on guests that are changing the world, impacting the world in a big way, okay? Today's guest is definitely doing just that, okay? It's my pleasure, Dr. Talal Debs. How are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure to have you. I was reading your resume, reading into your businesses. It's very impressive stuff. So I know you got a lot going on right now, but I want to go into a little bit of your backstory, give the audience some context as to who you are and what you do. So maybe a little brief intro for anyone who hasn't heard about you before, what you do. Who are you and what do you do?
So right now I run Zefiro Methane Corporation, which is a public company here in Toronto. All our activities are in the US, so sometimes people think we're an American company, but we're a North American business.
Okay.
And that business, which is an environmental services business, but a few short years ago, I was in my second career, which was as a banker at JP Morgan in New York. And prior to that, I was an academic. I taught philosophy at the London School of Economics and the American University of Beirut.
Wow.
And wrote a book on the foundations of quantum theory. And so I've had, now I'm in my third career, which is being an entrepreneur.
So you go from quantum physics to finance, right? How does that happen?
Well, my life story is probably a lot more like other people's life story. Pretty usual. Sometimes things happen by happenstance.
Okay.
Right? And so there are clearly people, you use math in finance, but you don't use complicated math.
True.
And so, no, I think it's because I was always interested in energy.
Okay.
My dad was a professor of electrical engineering at Georgia Tech.
Okay.
He immigrated here from Lebanon in the late 50s. And by here, I mean Boston.
Okay.
And so, I've always been interested in the real world. And I think that's what kept me sort of going between more intellectual pursuits and then more practical pursuits. And finance seemed like a great way for me at the time to apply myself to real on-the-ground opportunities.
Yeah. So you would say at a young age, were you driven by success, or was it driven by adding value or seeing change? What was your motivation?
Well, now you're asking me a hard question. What is my own motivation?
Yeah.
I think if I back up and assess myself as much as possible from a third party point of view, I think financial success personally has never been an end in itself for me. I started, my school years were between Atlanta, Georgia, and we lived in Kuwait when I was in junior high.
Okay.
And the Iran-Iraq war was going on at that time.
Wow.
And so, I think I developed pretty early on this idea that meaning, the meaning in my life, and bringing myself authentically to the situation was the most important thing.
Yeah.
And I've ended up having, as I mentioned, an academic life, and a banking life, and I've gone back and forth more than once.
Yeah. What's your thoughts on the academic life? Because, we talk a lot about that present day, obviously, right? And I think a lot has changed in education. And that's something I want to talk to you about because obviously, you've gone to some of the highest education. You've been part of some of the highest education. What do you think has changed in terms of education, let's say the last 20 years? Because I think there has been a lot of changes.
Undoubtedly, there has been. And I'm still in touch with all my academic friends who stayed in the academy.
Yeah.
And I think they're all saying some similar things, which is they feel, and this is not new, but they feel like the institutions that they teach at don't necessarily reward true teaching. And it's sort of the advent of very large classes and AI and has really changed the educational landscape.
For sure.
But for me, even in academia, I was a little bit of an odd duck because, give an example, I did my PhD at Cambridge in the UK, and it was in the philosophy of quantum mechanics. And there were two big camps in the department there. There were the sociologists of science, kind of the anthropologists who were really pushing cultural context, relativity of thought that I think is axiomatic for my generation. And then there were the hard foundations of physics guys who were basically doing meta-theoretical physics.
Yeah.
And so I couldn't choose, so I did both. And so my book, which came out afterwards, was all about how do you find philosophical objectivity amidst different models and ways of conceptualizing the world in a hard physics context.
Okay.
And so I've always been drawn to trying to somehow refuse to be dichotomized as either a relativist or an objectivist.
I like that. I think that's great experience to have. It shows that, you've brought that to where you are today as well. Let's talk about JP Morgan because it's a company everyone hears about all the time. Big company. Wow, JP Morgan. How was your time there? What were you doing exactly at JP Morgan?
Yeah, so I had 2 long stints at JP Morgan.
Okay.
I joined as an analyst right out of undergrad.
Okay.
I did physics undergrad, and then
So you did the physics undergrad that you got to. So how did you get into JP Morgan?
Oh, that's a funny story.
Yeah.
So I went to I did undergrad.
Okay.
Majored in physics and history,
Okay.
and I still couldn't decide, so I double majored. and so
Which is really common, by the way. A lot of people will do that.
yeah, but it's also like I'm an only child, and my mother was a science writer for the
Okay.
Harvard Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory,
Okay.
and my dad was a professor of electrical engineering. So I did both.
Yep.
Anyway,
Made them both proud.
yeah, I hope so.
Yeah.
But no, I went off right after undergrad to a 1-year master's at Cambridge.
Okay.
And I ended up not thinking I was going to go into academia at all. But I ended up publishing one of my papers in the American Journal of Physics.
Wow.
It's on how to understand the twin paradox in Einstein's special relativity theory. And if you're curious and you Google the twin paradox, the last time I checked, the Wikipedia article on twin paradox is pretty much cribbed from my 1994 paper.
Wow.
And all the diagrams were pulled from that paper too, because I can see the mistakes.
30 years later.
Yeah. And so, but look, what happened was I wanted to get back to New York for personal. I was dating a girl in New York,
Okay.
and I was like, I got to figure this out. Whatever I do, I got to be in New York. So I put out my resume to some high schools to teach physics.
Okay.
Went there for a day to interview for high school physics teaching, and I had the afternoon free. So I went down to Wall Street and called to some friends.
Okay.
And I left New York with 2 investment banking offers and no offers to teach physics.
A blessing.
And it was total happenstance. That's
sure.
a theme in my life. I showed up, as it turned out, on the day that the JP Morgan analyst program for that year had to give their answers.
Yeah.
And one less person accepted than they expected, and they needed another person.
Oh my God.
And they're like, well, and I came down there talking to, maybe maybe like I'd like to learn about what it is to be an analyst in investment banking. And they're like, well, could you interview now? And anyway, I got the job. It was very lucky.
Time and place.
Yeah. So I went into that and did energy banking. I banked the power companies.
Okay. What is that? What does that entail?
So for me, it's always easier to talk about an example. So at that time, J.P. Morgan was the old storied J.P. Morgan. We had a 6-month training program at 23 Wall, which still has the pockmarks from the 1910 explosion. And anyway, in that group, our clients were mostly electric utilities.
Okay.
Who were looking for loans, but also M&A advice.
Okay.
And bankruptcy advice.
Wow.
And so that was a blast. I had a blast, at the time. I don't know if banking is still this way, but at the time, even as a pretty junior guy, I was able to, I was sent within 6 weeks of showing up to go meet clients on my own.
Wow.
And help fix their situations. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
But then I got a call back from my department at Cambridge, my prior department, about a year and a half, 2 years into it. And they said, look, you published a paper that's actually pretty good. Not everyone does that. And we'd like to offer you a scholarship to come back and finish your PhD.
Wow.
And so here I am again, falling into the next thing.
Yeah.
So I went and did my PhD at Cambridge.
Okay.
I was there for 4 years and had a blast. It's on, as I mentioned before, it's on objectivity and subjectivity as it comes through the models of quantum mechanics and relativity theory.
Yeah.
And then I ended up getting a job teaching at LSE and AUB. And then I got married to my wife, and we're still married. And we have 2 kids. But at the time, I was teaching at the LSE, and my wife, who was being very not so subtle, would say things like, oh, you see that man over there with the rotting sweater? And, he's a homeless person. Yeah. He said, I think that's the head of the archaeology department, isn't it? And the joke was that you don't make any money in academia. Yeah. And that's certainly especially true in the UK. The UK academia is sort of notoriously low paid. Wow. And so did that for, until we thought we were going to have kids. And then I said, look, I got to make some money. And again, I put my resume out to a few places, and I get a call from J.P. Morgan offering me my old job back 8 years later.
And just to stop you, when you were first there and then you left, did you accept that second job and get less money for the teaching job when you first left JP Morgan?
Yeah.
You accepted less money?
Oh, yeah.
Wow. And then you're like, okay, well, that was actually maybe a mistake because this is too much of less money.
Exactly.
So let's get back. But it's interesting to me because these opportunities are kind of coming to you. You're not really reaching out and saying, hey, I'd like my job back, or I'd like to teach. Like, the opportunities are coming your way.
Well, it's a funny thing. Yes, that's
constantly.
True. That's true. But, what I've found is opportunities come my way once I start earnestly looking. So I'll be out there looking. Yeah. I wanted to get to New York.
Okay.
And I had sort of determined, okay, my key goal is I want to get to New York and figure out whether I'm going to, be serious about this girl I'd been dating long distance.
Yeah.
So I made that my paramount, decider. And the job came along to that.
Wow.
And I ended up getting a ton out of the job. The relationship didn't work out.
Oh.
But that's totally fine.
Yeah, that's cool.
But I ended up meeting the girl I eventually married. So,
It's crazy because sometimes when you make a decision for a woman, it actually sometimes backfires.
Yeah.
Right? Which I've heard in the past. A lot of people, I did this and then I regret it. But for you, again, it seems like it was a blessing in disguise again. Just like a walking 4-leaf clover at this point. Right?
Yes. I mean, it was very odd. Yeah.
Okay. So you don't stay with her, but the job ends up going very well. You end up staying at JP Morgan for much longer at that point.
Yes. So I moved back to the States, stayed at JP Morgan for another 15 years.
Wow.
All in. And I went back in 2005.
Okay.
And I got to be there through the whole '08 financial crisis, which was a trip
What was
to
that
be
like?
there.
What was that like? Like,
Well, okay, so it's such an interesting period because now it's pretty long ago,
for sure.
and but my desk was next to, believe it or not, the fax machine on the floor,
Okay.
which they still had.
Okay.
And the reason they had fax machines was that all the mortgage paper that had been issued, the so-called subprime structured notes and all that, and the credit default swaps,
Okay.
had all been invented in the prior decade, actually by two of the key innovators, are Blythe Masters, who was running global commodities, and I worked in that group, and then the guy now who Jeremy Barnum, who was my classmate in my induction program, is now the CFO
Wow.
at JP Morgan. And so the good guys sometimes stay the course. Wow. But anyway, in that original formulation of credit default swaps, if you had a default or a downgrade that would cause a triggering event in the contract, you know, one of the ways you could notify the bank would be by fax machine.
Oh my God.
And so the fax machine, which had sat there for, I don't know, on that floor, had been there a year, nothing had come across the fax machine.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it was going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, just reams of paper on the floor. And what it was downgrade notices for different tranches of mortgage debt. Wow. And it was, tranche number XYZ was, AA, now triple C.
Yep.
And I looking at this piece of paper thinking, and a whole pile, a stack that no one could even go through.
Yeah.
And you're thinking, okay, someone really, really got that wrong.
Yeah.
Because a downgrade from even one notch in credit ratings should be a tail event. It should be like a less than 1%.
But it was happening so much.
And it was like 6 notches.
Yeah.
From strong investment grade to strong junk.
Yeah.
Basically default. And so, that was my sort of tangible experience of the financial crisis.
Because, I was, I think, 14, 15 when that happened, right? So I didn't get to, see the world and how people were reacting, the news. But, I love watching the movie The Big Short. Great movie. I love it, right?
Great movie and a good book.
Did they do a good job portraying what happened?
I think they did a great job. I mean, it's hard to make financial stuff gripping.
Yeah, of course.
And I found that, he's a good writer.
Yeah.
And I thought the movie was really good.
Yeah.
And I think it does illustrate some key things about the way people get into a cul-de-sac of thought in the world of business and finance.
Yeah.
That we still have to look out for.
It's interesting because like at the end of the movie too, and I'd want your opinion on this for sure. They say, okay, well, that was ended, that happened. And then they say like in 2016, these bonds came back or something, right? Like they were started again.
Yeah.
So were the same bonds and that whole situation kind of replicated again?
Well, I mean, the bond market, they've sort of redid them with a lot more discipline.
Okay.
And I think they were super cognizant on that product, particularly how to prevent the kind of runaway problems that they had before. Yeah. So I don't expect they'll have more problems in that market. But then there's always some market where people are systematically ignoring risk. Yeah. And that's really
such a scary thing, though. Such a scary thing to think about, right? Like, just scary that, like, for me, it's scary because there's a few people that make those decisions. It's not made by, the population or anything like that. So just scary, right? But I just wanted your take on it because you were in that space for a long time.
I heard a story from one of the guys that I knew that time who sat next to the mortgage-backed trader.
Wow.
And he said that summer, Jamie Dimon had come down to the floor and himself sat down on the desk with the mortgage-backed trader, trying to understand the way they were risking the different tranches. Mm-hmm. And he came 3 weeks in a row. Wow. And then the story was, and I don't know, I didn't hear this from Jamie himself, but that was when he decided to start getting out of that line. And it reminds me of something from my academic. There's a famous physicist called Feynman.
Okay.
He was teaching at, I think, Caltech or on the West Coast.
Okay.
And Feynman's genius in physics, and one of his famous quips was he said, if you can't explain it well, you don't understand it.
It's true.
And then famously, he said after 20 years of teaching quantum electrodynamics, he concluded that he didn't understand it because he didn't know how to explain it well.
Wow.
It's something like that. It might
Yeah.
be not QED, but that's the gist of it.
Yeah.
And I think all evidence seems to be that Jamie took that same approach, which was, okay, like you weren't able to explain it to me in 3 sessions.
Yeah.
Something isn't adding up.
Yeah.
And I do think that's kind of gets to the core of my philosophy, which is, like let's just walk through the steps simply. Let's deconstruct the problem.
Yeah.
And if we get to something that doesn't follow from A to B,
Yeah.
we either can find the gap or bridge the gap logically, or there's a problem.
True. Do you think that, my last question on this, do you think that there was a situation where maybe the people at the high levels making decisions knew that even if everything collapsed, they would be bailed out?
Well, I actually don't think so at JP Morgan.
Okay. Well,
But
yeah, you
I've
can speak on
learned,
JP Morgan.
but I've
for sure.
learned JP Morgan is a pretty unique culture,
Okay.
and especially appreciate it because now my whole team at Zefiro is almost all JP Morgan at the
Okay.
top level. But the I do think there is a subtle. We all do this.
Mm-hmm.
Like we all assume that do you speed?
Yeah.
Do
Must be a lot. Yeah.
do you maybe not pay some bills on time because you don't want to?
I see what you're saying.
And so what people have a little reserve in the back of their mind. They go, it'll be fine. I can
Yeah.
delay that. I can get away with it.
Yeah.
And especially if you kind of take some risk you shouldn't have and you get away with it once
Mm-hmm.
and you get away with it 3 times, then you sort of throw all caution to the wind,
Yeah.
right? And I think that can happen in our personal lives. And it definitely can happen in business. And that's why it's important to have partners that can hold you to account
Yeah.
and remind you, hey, what are we doing here?
Yeah. Some accountability around you. The good people around you will hold you accountable.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, so let's transition into Zefiro.
Love to do that.
So how do you go from JP Morgan now to Zefiro, and why? That's my first question. And then we'll get into the business, the systems, the processes that you guys use, and why your business is so important right now.
Right. So look, I mean, since we've got a little bit of time, I'll
course.
go back to 2017. I was contemplating leaving JP Morgan after a long career.
Okay.
Not because it wasn't fascinating. It was endlessly fascinating. I was always working on, new twists.
Okay.
But I noticed it was hard to escape the idea that, the financial markets were changing. You had one of the moments where Bitcoin has been on this sort of Gartner hype cycle for a while. Comes in, goes out, comes in, and it was on the ascendant. And I thought blockchain was actually a really cool idea. And I just thought, if I stay here, I'm gonna know even more about regulated banking in the U.S. And sort of investment grade energy companies.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me the interesting stuff that's going to happen, in my life, rest of my lifetime, is innovation, change, transformation. And so I decided to leave and try something new. I tried a couple different things, and then during COVID, ended up deciding to start a business, which is actually the parent company, XMC Strategies, which is a small private equity pool of capital that I raised with a mission of changing the way that energy gets financed.
Wow.
And so the thinking behind it, and it's still very much part of what we do,
Yeah.
is that, the way things get financed oftentimes drives behaviors.
Okay.
And behaviors, in a way, can reinforce the way things get financed.
Can you give me an example?
Well, one good example would be the mortgage crisis that we just talked about.
True.
Okay, so the Wall Street group, and engineers came up with tranching the risk. All worked great. It brought down the cost of capital. It allowed more people to borrow.
That's their
buy
behavior.
homes.
Yeah, that was their behavior. Okay.
So the intended behavior was to make the intended idea was to make mortgages cheaper, to bring in new investment classes into mortgages. The unintended consequence was that it made the bar so low to buying a home that individuals started to speculate in homes, which is not a speculative asset class, or ought not to be, like, for everyday people who also have 9-to-5 jobs.
For sure.
And so that was so the behavior there was actually an epiphenomenon of a financial engineering change.
Yeah.
It wasn't a good behavior, and it led to a lot of financial losses.
Okay.
And so what I'd watched happen in energy was, this is the conundrum, and it's still largely the case. Energy markets generally are one of the largest markets in the world. It's trillions of dollars of notional.
For sure.
And for people who buy stocks or people who invest in private equity, you know, they've had the experience of buying, say, traditional energy companies, say oil companies, and those guys are always going bankrupt every 4 years. They seem to be swinging around, and there were several bankruptcy cycles even in my time on Wall Street.
Okay.
And, well, that's weird. I mean, these are big established companies with big balance sheets, and they get banked by leading banks. Why are they always going bankrupt?
Yeah.
And I thought that was weird.
For sure.
And these are smart people running the businesses. Yeah. And the other thing was, you know, for clean energy, it seemed like people were building a lot of wind farms and solar, which is really important. And, you know, I first fell in love with solar when in Kuwait, when my dad was involved in putting the first solar farms there in the 80s.
Wow.
And so I'm a big believer in solar and alternative energy, but the investment returns were kind of hard for me to figure out because they seemed to be really low. And they needed government subsidies to make it work.
Okay.
And so I thought, well, how can it be that if I want to invest in energy, I can pick, you know, door A is traditional energy, but the results are not great and they go bankrupt
And
a
they
lot.
keep going bankrupt. Yeah.
And door B is clean energy,
Not enough money.
and I can get like 6% returns, which barely keeps up with inflation.
Yeah.
You know,
So you had those two options. Okay.
and so I thought, you know, there's got to be something here where the way these places, these entities are getting financed has not kept up with the way the entities actually are.
Okay.
And
There's behind.
yeah, so
Okay.
each entity and each company is like, it's like a person, right?
Okay.
You tailor the suit to the person. And, you know, one example I could use is, you know, the old Brooks Brothers suit. Classic gray Brooks Brothers suit. You're supposed to wear that when you go to Wall Street. It's great. If you're like me, Brooks Brothers has actually changed. But when I started, you know, they were designed for people who didn't have what they politely call an athletic build, which means they were wider and shorter.
Okay.
And so, you know, the issue is that a lot of the way that the industry was being financed was a rinse and repeat of the way maybe, you know, Texaco had been financed
Okay.
50 years before.
Okay.
And so,
So you see, that's when you saw the opportunity. Like
I
there,
saw a
there
real
was some
opportunity.
sort of opportunity. Yeah.
yeah, and look, one of my side jobs, or, you know, my jobs, JP Morgan was running I had a dozen petroleum engineers working for me
Okay.
that did all the collateral valuation work behind the scenes.
Okay.
And I thought, how is it? And then in 2016, I think we had like a big slump in oil prices. And I think JP Morgan had dozens of companies that looked like they were going to go bust. I mean, they were not looking good, you know, they because the oil price slump.
For sure.
And I thought, how is it that I've got a dozen engineers who are getting detailed reports on their production and looking at their seismic and understanding everything about their business, and we're lending to them and they have hedging access, and they're all still going, it didn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And so I set up the business during COVID, XMC,
Okay.
with the idea of let's figure out if this can be done differently.
Okay.
And one of the first things I rolled up my sleeves, I realized was that there are a lot of exogenous factors that are driving decisions that people don't really want to, that people have kind of not wanted to deal with. There's an elephant in the room. And for oil and gas in particular, it was the combined environmental, cleanup cost
Okay.
that was gradually accruing on the oil fields that were being developed by our client base.
Okay.
And as I understood what that was, I realized, actually, the solution to that problem is to find a way to clean up that environmental mess more proactively. And I think it's a huge market that we could make a lot of money doing it.
Okay. So those companies that were going bankrupt, so that was the reason. The cleanup side of it, you're saying.
Well, there's a lot of different.
I'm sure there's
reasons.
many, of course.
One of the reasons was, again, the old Brooks Brothers suit analogy.
Yeah, of course.
A lot of them had investment hurdles where management or private equity teams would only get paid if you beat a certain hurdle.
Okay.
So like, classically in private equity, it's 2% fees, 20% incentive,
Okay.
and an 8% pref,
Okay.
which means that, if you return money that exceeds an 8% reference hurdle, and above that, you get, you get to share 20% of the profits.
Okay.
And so the problem is that oil and gas is sort of natural yield, if you're not doing a lot of drilling,
Yeah.
is more like a 15%
Okay.
return.
Okay.
So if the natural yield of these properties, risk adjusted for the volatility of oil, is below the amount where you're ever going to get a bonus, what are you going to do as a manager?
Yeah.
Well, you're going to lever it up. So you put less capital to work, less capital work,
Yeah.
and you're going to hedge as little as possible.
Yeah.
Because if oil goes up, everyone looks like a hero.
Mm.
And if oil goes down, well, it'll be difficult, but it's going to go up.
For sure.
And that's the way that people have been managing for a long time.
Okay.
And so, the reason why people were taking too much risk was they were only going to get paid if they got certain returns that were being determined by it arbitrarily.
Yeah.
2 and 20 with an 8% pref is a private equity market model
Yeah.
for companies.
True.
They just brought it across and
So you're saying
applied
they're
it to
trying to-
oil and gas.
Oh, okay. So you're saying what they were doing was they're applying these I guess these concept systems or theories or whatever it might be to
Yeah.
oil and gas, which didn't make sense for that space.
It didn't make sense for that particular asset
Yeah.
class and the way that it actually works in reality.
And they were kind of just whatever, we'll just keep using it kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like we'll just keep using the system anyways.
What they ended up doing was needing to take more risk to get the returns. And they did it through leverage and not hedging.
Okay.
And so, look, that's a big reason of why, that cyclical activity was working. But also, one of the things you find in the oil and gas market is that you go through long periods of time when the markets just freeze up. Sellers don't sell, buyers don't buy. The bid offer between buyers and sellers just isn't near each other.
Okay.
And one of the reasons for that is that, there is for an asset that trades at a certain number, everyone kind of knows, well, actually, there's a big environmental cleanup cost that's hanging around the asset.
Mm-hmm.
And different buyers have different approaches how to mitigate that.
Okay.
But one thing they generally don't do is try and really price it and reduce it.
Also, they weren't even including it, the cleanup
They often
side.
don't include it,
Okay.
at least traditionally,
True.
because the idea was, well, look, that's a problem. I can delay that problem. I have other problems now.
I need the product first.
Yeah.
We'll figure that out later.
Yeah, it's sort of like, if you own a home and the gutters need cleaning,
Yeah.
and you think, well, but I have a hole in my roof, so I'm going to fix that.
Okay. Priorities.
And then it just never comes up as the priority.
Yeah.
And so what's ended up happening and what I ended up discovering, and this is like, it's nothing like The Big Short, but it kind of bears some small analogy.
Okay.
What's happened over the last 100 plus years, in North American oil and gas, is that, 1883 was the Drake well in Pennsylvania, the first, commercial production that, is recorded.
Yeah.
And so the whole country went through its sort of storied history of going out to Texas and really developing oil and gas.
Mm-hmm.
The emphasis at that time was always, let's get more oil and gas.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We need the energy. It's cheap energy. It's really effective. It was obviously a paradigm shift for the whole world economy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's great so far as it is. But in each generation, if you're an oil developer, and you had $1 to spend in your account, and you could choose to drill a new well with that $1 or to clean up an old well that no one's really making you clean it up,
Yep.
what are you going to do?
And that past generations have left as well and not
Yeah,
clean.
and you're going to say, well, look, I'll do the minimum on the cleanup,
Yeah.
but my real job is bringing oil to market.
Okay.
And that's not wrong. That's what oil companies
For sure.
are supposed to do.
Makes sense.
Right. But because of this perverse incentive to essentially have no good reason to ever plug a well,
Crazy.
what we have today, and I'm giving you U.S. numbers. I'm
course.
more familiar with that.
Okay.
Famously, the U.S. produces approximately 13 million barrels a day of oil and gas in barrels of oil equivalent. And that's a sort of like any large number. It's sort of hard for people to conceptualize, like
Of course.
what is that? It's big.
Yeah.
What is it? How big is it? It's it makes us, arguably, the top, and sometimes the top producer in the world. Wow. It still is a drop in the bucket of global consumption. It's important, but wouldn't solve everything.
Yeah.
And what people don't think about is, well, where is that coming from? Today, roughly speaking, that's coming from about 1 million holes in the ground
In the U.S.
1 million wells
Wow.
across about 26 states that have proven reserves.
1 million wells.
And so simple averages, that's 13 barrels of oil a day or a barrel of oil equivalent. I mean, it's a lot, but it's not exactly a gusher.
Well, with that many wells, of course, no.
Yeah, and when you really dig into the numbers,
Yeah.
you find that there are a small number of wells, maybe that top 200,000 wells,
Okay.
that are highly prolific wells. They're producing, thousands of barrels a day.
Wow.
And they have a big fat tail of wells that are producing 5 barrels a day or less.
Okay.
And so behind that, and so all that 800,000 wells, those are kind of what you would really call marginal.
Yeah.
5 barrels a day is fine. And hey, it could be a really good well. But if something happens and you need to work on it, you don't have a lot of economics in that well. If it were 50 barrels a day, it would always be worth fixing. But if it's 5 barrels a day,
I see what you're saying.
it's like, ooh, do I really want to spend the money to fix it?
So about 80% of them are doing about 5 barrels a day.
Yeah.
And there's a really good chance that a big portion of those 80% might just walk away at any point.
They might just become non-economic.
Wow.
And so, in fact, that's what happens. And so, if you pull the data today on various data systems, approximately 5 million wells have reached the point where they've just been shut in. They turned off the spigot. They're still on someone's producing oil field, but they're sitting there. So, got 1 million producing wells and a backlog of 5 times that amount that are just sitting there.
Wow.
So, and that's because the producers haven't been given a proper incentive to do it. And this is the structural market reason that I think is going on.
Okay.
Is that, we've passed laws, we have regulators, they mean very well, clean this up.
Well, I was going to say, was there any responsibility on the companies?
There's all sorts of contractual responsibility to clean it up. But the thing is, there is no market reason to plug the wells.
Okay.
And so my philosophy is that, regulation should align with the incentives of the market.
I like that.
If you have a regulation that is going against where the incentive structures are,
Yeah.
it's always going to be super hard to enforce. And you're going to have to, if it's sort of like there are regulations, if you play any game, play baseball,
Yep.
good players love having a good ref. They
Yeah.
like the rules.
Yeah.
Because it allows them to play the game and compete on the levels that they want to compete on.
Mm-hmm.
But so the kind of two have to fit,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And what was going on here is there was no market incentive for anyone to actually clean up a well.
True.
And so you have 5 million idle wells. Now, we haven't even gotten to the market opportunity for Zefiro.
Okay.
So what I then realized, and this wasn't even public data 2 or 3 years ago, it's been coming out gradually, was that what happens eventually is companies will eventually go bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
They dwindle down to the point where they're producing, say they have 10 wells producing 5 barrels a day. They're collecting that money, and they have 100 wells that are waiting around to get plugged, which will eventually cost 20 times what those 5 wells will ever produce.
Wow.
And someday someone switches out the light, bankrupts the company, and those wells end up going through a legal process, which it's either a Chapter 7 or a Chapter 11, and it's an insolvency.
Okay.
And what ends up happening is they end up being wards of the state. So the state of Pennsylvania, for instance, has millions of these wells.
Just not.
They're just sitting around.
Okay.
And because a lot of these wells were drilled a long time ago, the land is no longer occupied by the people
Who were there before?
who owned the wells.
Wow.
Because that ownership can be split, and it usually is.
Okay.
And so you have basically a situation where, like in Ohio, we've got 1,000 landowners that we've agreed to. They've asked us to come on their land and look at the wells that are there.
Okay.
Because the wells belong to the state. They've been orphaned.
Yeah.
So, and they've gone through a bankruptcy. There's no one who is really on the hook to pay for it. And the taxpayer doesn't want to necessarily pay for it either.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah.
But there's a landowner, and the thing is like spitting out, these things degrade.
Yeah.
And they're leaking natural gas liquids into the soil, and there's maybe methane spewing out, killing trees downwind of it. And, it's a nasty sight.
Okay.
And they look at it and they go, well, could I even clean it up myself? Well, you couldn't, because you don't own it.
Yeah.
It's
True.
property of the state.
True.
So you got to actually deal with a lot of paperwork, go to the state, and you say, this is a legal morass of the landowner. They go to the state and they say, I would like to take care of that well. Now, Pennsylvania has passed laws to change this.
Okay.
So it's a little easier now.
Okay.
But until very recently, if you said, I want to clean up that well, they'd say, that's fine. You touch it, it's yours. And if it costs $1 million because there's a giant oil spill that we don't know about underground,
it's up to you.
that's you.
Yeah.
So you think landowners want to deal with that?
Fuck no. Hell no.
So you've got a situation where now a lot of those orphan wells have just kind of floated through the system.
Yeah.
And because no one is on the hook to deal with it, and even if you try to be a good Samaritan, in some cases, you can get punished for it.
Yeah.
There's now, according to EPA estimates, 3.7 million orphan wells in the U.S. Wow. Now, again, large numbers are hard to conceptualize.
For sure.
But on average, in our experience, it costs about $100,000 US to plug a well.
Okay.
And by plug, I mean you get out there with the right equipment. You basically put a double redundancy seal to make sure that no hydrocarbons are going to come up to the surface anymore.
Okay.
And that could be in the form of liquids or gas.
Okay.
And then you go downhole and you use downhole explosives to cut away the piping and the casing, anything that's loose that could be near the surface and cause a problem for the water table. And
Okay.
Or say someone comes later and wants to build a building, they don't know there's a piece of concrete and steel down there.
True.
You want to remove that so you don't later have someone try and dig it up with a backhoe and end up causing a leak.
Okay.
And so you get all that out and you remove any contaminated soil, deal with that. You remove any contaminated fluids that are in the old well.
Yeah.
And that whole thing costs anywhere from, on the low end, roughly 50 grand. On the high end, it could be over $1 million per well.
Wow.
But the rule of thumb we use is it costs $100,000 a well on average.
Okay.
So applying that to 3.7 million orphan wells, that's close to $400 billion
Wow.
of unfunded liability. It's just sitting there across 26 states, contaminating people's backyards.
Yeah. Can you explain how dangerous it actually is that these are open?
Yeah, it is really dangerous.
Right?
Yeah, people have developed a false sense of security, and
For sure.
a lot of these oil-producing regions, people take it for granted that there's probably an old oil or gas well on their property.
Yeah.
And the more enterprising ones have even sometimes tried to capture that methane and bootleg it into their house.
Oh my God.
Not a safe thing to do.
Oh my God. That's
but
insane.
no,
But I think that it is a big importance, right? Because that's the part where you're coming in, being innovative, changing something, right?
yeah,
There's the problem where it's like, okay, well, first of all, we should incentivize people to close these.
yeah.
Number one. Number two, there's a huge health risk to having that many open wells.
Well, there's some stat that came out that I think it came from one of the nonprofits that they'd looked at 14 million Americans living within 1 mile of an orphan well.
Yeah.
That vastly underestimates the number because that study I think was done on a pretty small subsection of orphan wells, like confirmed orphan wells that
Yeah.
we find orphan wells that aren't on any register every day. And so, but how dangerous is it? Well, the danger of an orphan well is it's spewing out basically a volatile substance near where your dwelling is.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the gases from these things will infiltrate the foundations of new build that didn't know that there was a well there and can cause a fire or an explosion and loss of life.
Yeah.
These are pretty rare, but even a few of those events should be prevented. And look, there are people who try, but there's a lot of these old wells,
Yeah.
and they're not cheap to deal with. And what are the other things that are wrong with methane gas? Look, methane gas in a pipeline, if it's going to your boiler, is a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
It's cheap, clean energy source.
Yeah.
But if it's coming out in a nuisance quantity that's not really commercially relevant and just wafting around, it's toxic. It causes everything from headaches and malaise and just feeling unwell to, in the extreme, it can kill you if you have a concentration of the gas. It also, when it comes out of the ground, can be associated with impurities like hydrogen sulfide, which is lethally fatal. It's just tough poison gas. That's very rare, but not so rare that deaths don't happen.
Yeah.
So this is a toxic gas.
Okay.
And the other thing is it comes up with natural gas liquids, which are the propane, ethane, butane, these longer hydrocarbon chains. So methane, for the chemists in the room, its chemical formula is CH4. So it's carbons and hydrogens, and it's a very short chain, and hence it's a gas.
Okay.
As you add more carbons and hydrogens to the molecule chain, you get things that are they're liquid at atmospheric temperature, and pressure, and those are your ethanes, propanes, butanes.
Yes.
And then everything down to crude oil is an even longer hydrocarbon chain. And so those longer chains also can end up migrating through these leaky wells into the aquifer.
Wow.
And, it is a well-known anecdotal reality if you talk to people who live especially in Western PA or Western New York, where you have 100 years plus of oil and gas and a lot of old wells. Very often people won't take the risk of drinking their own water. They'll be drinking bottled water.
True.
And, I didn't really even know that because I'd never lived there. But I know when I talk to people from those regions, they're like, yeah, of course, we wouldn't drink the water.
Wow.
And so, so who knows what the other impacts are, right?
For sure.
And I think there are health impacts. It's very touchy and political.
Yeah.
But, the last impact of methane is that it is a greenhouse gas, a very potent one. And it is, like CO2, there's a lot of talk about CO2.
For sure.
And, CO2 has obviously a big impact on climate. And it has been the most talked about gas probably.
For sure.
But methane is about 85 times more potent as a greenhouse gas
85.
than CO2.
Wow.
So it's just a much more warming, dense gas. And CO2 isn't toxic. I'm breathing out CO2 right now.
Yeah.
Right? So, methane is toxic.
Yeah. Wouldn't want
And
you breathing that out for sure.
And so there's been a real appreciation now that, methane is probably, if we're going to look at emission reductions as developed economies,
Yeah.
methane reduction is probably the biggest bang for your buck. And, what we've discovered through the process of building Zefiro
Yeah.
is that the methane leaking out of these orphan wells accounts for about close to 10% of the fugitive methane coming from industrial processes in these economies. And when you think about that, 10% of the worst kind of pollution is coming from wells that no one is responsible for.
It's too much. It's way too much.
So we got to have a solution.
Yeah. So okay, before we get into, the start and how you guys, the business model behind it. So you pretty much we're in a position starting your first business technically, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty daunting task to go into a space like that and change it. Obviously you have great intentions and you want to change the world for the better, but was it intimidating at all for you to get into that space in a big way and say, well, I'm not going in here to change $1 million industry. I'm actually trying to change a multi-trillion-dollar industry.
Right.
How was that for you?
Oh, really exhilarating.
Oh, was it? Okay.
I mean, it's exciting. Look, it's being an entrepreneur, starting my first business, and now I've started more than one, did not come naturally to me.
Okay.
I mean, I was an academic, and then I was a banker, and so I never would have thought I would do this. But it came down to a really key discussion I had with a CEO of a large public company who I was introduced to getting advice.
Okay.
And I said, I'm thinking of, could I get some career advice? We do this if we're wise. We ask smart people.
Always.
And I said, I'm thinking of, this was during COVID, maybe I'd go back to banking, or maybe I could be a consultant, and I'm qualified for all that,
For sure.
and then I kind of as an afterthought, but I got this idea to start a business, and I know it's stupid, and who am I to start a business? But here's the idea. And this guy is a former McKinsey partner, and I'd never met him before.
Okay.
He's a friend of a friend. And he backed up from it, and he's like, I think you should start the business. Like, that's not what I expect you to say.
You didn't even want him to say it almost.
I was, I felt like I was saying, hey, I've got this cool idea for a Mexican restaurant.
Yep.
Like, it's been done, guy.
Yep.
And so I
But hold on, let me pause you there. It hadn't been done, right?
It hadn't been done.
Right? So there was no other companies doing that.
That's right.
Wow.
I mean, generically, to start a business, I was just I thought it was pretty, like, really, honestly.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask someone for money to do this.
Yeah.
And, but I talked to a few people, some of whom are on my board now, who are like just remarkable people. Like one of the guys who founded, he was one of the first 4 partners of a big $200 billion hedge fund in Greenwich called AQR Capital, Advanced Quantitative Research. And you spent a lot of time with him, and he said, look, you got to believe in yourself. Like, you're really good in the details. You see the problem really clearly, and you have good solutions. And then another guy who's on our board, who's now one of the co-chairs of the Dalio Trust, around another big Greenwich hedge fund.
Yeah.
And so these people talk to, I thought, if these really smart guys who deal with a lot of titans of industry think it's worth putting money behind me, I'll give it a shot.
Yep.
And so launched out on that in 2020, did our first raises in 2020, 2021, and then got started on this business in earnest in 2021.
I think you did something very smart, though, and this applies to a lot of people that are watching this, and we've said this before, but you went and gave your idea to people that were more successful than you.
Oh, yeah.
You didn't go to someone, you didn't go to your cousin and say, hey, you like this? So that's the thing. A lot of people, they share their ideas sometimes, and they feel really bad about them because they're telling the wrong people. So it's really good that you told the right people. It seems like that.
Yeah, I tell you, if I'd asked my peers, they would have politely said, "You want to be unemployed quickly?
What kind of drugs are you on, man?"
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's you do need to kind of go outside your and not be afraid someone to they may shoot you down.
For sure.
I mean, I had people, certainly a lot of people who did not want to invest with us.
For sure.
But having people who I respected a lot and have been on this journey with me has really bolstered the confidence that I have. And anyway, so that's how we got started.
Love it.
But what is different about, I think, the way that one of the comments that I was told by one of those guys was,
Okay.
he's like, when you're selling me on your idea, you've got to be the most rigorously negative salesperson I've ever met.
Wow.
And do you know what negative sales is?
No.
I didn't either.
Okay.
So negative sales is a salesman tactic.
Okay.
So the positive sales is you like, I'm going to sell you this car and I'm going to point to all the great things it does,
Okay.
right? Negative sales is to be like, to focus on all of its faults.
Wow.
And then by doing so, you gain the trust of your buyer that they're like, he's showing me all the faults. I can live with those.
Yeah.
I can see the good things. I'll buy it.
Honest guy.
And
Yeah.
it appeals to more sophisticated people who are risk thinkers,
Yeah.
are much more concerned whether the person who's taking their investment is sweating the ways you could lose the money than they are concerned about making the big money.
For sure.
And that's a little psychological asymmetry that has, because of my academic background and because I am pretty transparent, it means that when I do get in the room with someone who I've built a relationship with and they want to invest, they're usually saying, stop criticizing your own business.
True. But it is an honest approach, though.
Yeah.
So you've taken that approach, I guess, now?
Yeah, that's the way I go.
Okay.
Talk about, the whole thing, warts and all.
So I want to get into the business model because I think it's super interesting. This is something that I was reading up on the last few days, and I'm just like, oh my God, this is so cool. Like, this is very interesting. You have the carbon credit, and then the companies are buying the carbon credits from you, right? Correct?
Correct.
So walk me through that. I want to kind of define some of these terms for our audience that might have heard them but just don't know what they really mean. Okay. So a carbon credit, if you were to define what a carbon credit is.
Right. It's a bad word. I mean, in the sense that it's like a poorly defined word. It can mean lots of different things.
Okay.
But the most general way that it would be recognizable is it's a certificate, a piece of paper that attaches to the reduction of some atmospheric emission.
Okay.
So imagine, you're emitting from one of our wells, the methane is coming out of the ground. We measure that there's X tons of methane coming out of the ground. We clean it up, we seal it, we come back, we prove that it's not leaking anymore. Now we know that had that well continued to stay open, then there would have been X emissions over the next 20 years.
Okay.
And so the carbon credit is the piece of paper that lays out all the math and all the science and all the third-party verification
Okay.
to prove that, yeah, we did that work. And it's the best way to think of it is our customers that do buy carbon credits, they have run out of things they can fix at their own plants.
That
So
makes
they
sense.
might be an industrial.
Makes sense.
They fixed all their leaks,
Yeah.
but they're growing as a company.
Yeah.
They still have a lot of emissions. They promise their shareholders they want to be net zero or at least trying to be net zero. And so they need to start funding other emission reductions.
Like other companies too. Like
Yeah,
yeah. Okay.
they could, but
Oh, okay.
but why this opportunity is so good
Okay.
is that well, what are they going to fund? They're not going to fund their competitors' emission reduction because, well, that's their job.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they need to find problems that are big emissions problems that aren't naturally someone else's responsibility.
Yes.
And this orphan well pool, that was when the light bulb went off.
That's literally the perfect.
Yeah. It's hundreds of millions of tons of carbon equivalent leak.
Okay.
It is not anyone's responsibility. It's right here in our backyard. So one of the big problems with carbon credits when you get to the nitty gritty is verifying, getting auditors and verification companies to really give you rock solid evidence that this isn't fraud. Like there's a
Okay.
lot of fraud in the market at different times.
I could imagine.
And one of the big challenges is a lot of carbon credits traditionally were paying for cleanup in the third world or the 2/3 world.
Yeah.
And well, that's great. It's just, those are jurisdictions where, like I don't have people living in the third world on
Yeah.
my team.
Different countries completely. Yeah.
And I want to do projects where my team, the people who work for me,
Yeah.
are signing affidavits that they did the right thing.
Yeah.
And then we get an auditor to check it. Great, I have a third-party proof.
Okay.
But I'm not relying on multiple layers of third-party vendors
Okay.
that I may not know
Okay.
who could get things wrong. And it goes back to the mortgage crisis. I
For
mean,
sure.
one of the real problems that the mortgage crisis had was that they outsourced a lot of the mortgage origination, and the banks were paying third-party originators and third-party appraisers
That's who was approving them. Yep.
to approve it all and just dumping it into the conduit.
Yeah.
And they ended up finding out that that was a perverse incentive to stuff poorly underwritten loans.
Okay.
That's kind of what has happened in the carbon markets last year
Okay.
for traditional carbon markets, which are forestry carbon markets or other type of third world cook stove, improving the use of, reducing using charcoal for cooking at home was a big environmental push.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is that the verification chain was so long and so unconnected with the person issuing the carbon credit
Yeah.
that it proved impossible to fully eradicate, for at least a lot of players,
Okay.
to fully eradicate
Their
the
mission.
perverse incentives to
Yeah.
kind of cut corners.
Makes sense.
And so for us, we do everything. So I had this strong view, we need to do everything in-house. And in order to do that, I needed teams that knew how to do this work. And so, well, it's very expensive to stand up a team to just do the work for a bunch of orphan wells and hope that the carbon credit market comes to you,
True. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That is a recipe for
Bankruptcy.
a bankruptcy.
there you go.
So, my view, having watched this space since at least '08, when I helped set up the carbon desk at JP Morgan,
Yeah.
and I saw a lot of carbon developers coming through, was that, the big mistake they made was they tried to project finance all their carbon credits.
Okay.
So in other words, they said, I'm going to do a batch of carbon credits. I'll get someone to fund it. But there were no assets other than the carbon credits.
Okay.
There was no fundamental business. They were just deal guys. And that's great, and it worked well at that stage of the industry. But what we did was said, we want to have a core business.
Mm-hmm.
And our core business is the service of cleaning up old oil wells.
Yes.
It turns out that oil companies do have to pay for that service, at least sometimes.
Wow.
There is, I mentioned before, oil companies often delay their plugging,
Yep.
but they always do some plugging of wells.
Okay. Okay.
And so, and in fact, with greater corporate responsibility, oil companies are increasing the number of wells that they will go ahead and plug on their own dime
Okay.
by about 16% a year. So that native market is growing.
Mm-hmm.
And we bought a business and we integrated into Zefiro called Plants and Goodwin.
Okay.
And it's been around for about 5 decades.
Okay.
It's been doing this across 4 states in Appalachia. And, really knows the ropes, knows how to be safe. This is dangerous work to send crews out there, and is trusted by the industry. They really get a lot of the top Appalachian oil and gas companies will pay for them to come and clean up wells whenever they do decide to clean up a well.
Okay.
So that's kind of, if you like, the bedrock of our business that keeps the lights on.
Something stable. Yep.
And, right now that business is kind of circa 40 million a year of revenue
Wow.
coming in. We got 100-something employees.
Okay.
We try to read, it's a little bit seasonal, so that's why I'm vague on, we have a lot more workers in the summer
Okay.
and we have fewer rigs working in the winter. But on average, we're more than 100 people, full-time equivalent. And what they do day in and day out is meet the high standards of investment grade companies that have need for us to come in and clean up their well sites.
Okay.
So the business model for Zefiro was, okay, let's lock down the engine room, which is that business. Sorry, I
Yes.
keep hitting this thing.
It's okay.
And that business. And then we're going to add to that the carbon credit business. And the carbon credit business is, let's go tackle those 3.7 million wells.
Through the government.
Well, no,
Right? No?
I'm not even to the government yet.
Wow.
So the carbon credit market, we went out to some folks, 2 of them are public.
Okay.
EDF Trading is the trading arm of the French global energy company,
Okay.
sovereign company, Électricité de France. EDF Trading is obviously a pretty seasoned energy player globally. And They said, we love this idea. We will buy your credits. We will buy, if you can plug a well or some wells and get us some offsets. We agreed a price and we said, we'll deliver them. Wow. And we did that a long time ago. And we did that with a global commodity trader called Mercuria, a multi-billion-dollar player. Wow. So my idea was, like, I'm not going to make a carbon credit if I don't have a buyer. If I don't want to go through all this expense, creating a carbon credit, running it through the exchange,
and then no one wants to buy them,
and they're like, here, and like, not interested.
We're good, yeah.
So we did a little market testing, and we found that, and we have 2 other buyers that are behind the gate that are like
constantly buying.
Yeah, and so we began with, let's see if we can sell the idea of high quality carbon credits from orphan well mitigation with super high levels of data and attribution on the provenance of the verification.
Okay.
Which would distinguish us from, the traditional voluntary carbon market that got a lot of bad press, right? And, the fact that we got people like EDF and Mercuria not only to agree to buy our credits, but to agree to PR that that they're buying from us.
Wow, that's huge.
Is huge.
Of course.
Because that shows you that not only do we meet the bar of global multinational energy companies for quality, that they are so interested in what we're doing and it's so like aligned with their sustainability goals, they want to be associated with it.
Wow.
And so, and it's something which, you can think easily, oh, big deal, you sold some carbon credits.
That's
it's
very
it's
hard
actually
to do.
A huge deal.
For sure.
And so we sold those carbon credits really at the very beginning because I, again, did not want to, people were saying, well, why are you trying to sell carbon credits? You haven't even created any. And I said,
smart.
I want to know if I can sell them.
It's very smart.
And look, thank you.
Of course.
We have, and look, it's a lot of it is like all markets. People look you in the eye and they say, do I trust you're going to do what you say you're going to do?
Yep.
And we're very thankful for them, giving us that imprimatur of, real investment grade quality.
Yeah.
So that market, those orphan wells, that is going to be a very profitable line of business for us.
Sounds like it.
We're delivering our first batches this year.
Okay.
Takes a long time to get the first issuance.
Okay.
Have you talked to anyone who does like stock issuances or IPOs?
Yeah.
It's like that. You're going back and forth with the regulator and the exchange, and you think it's all done, and they say, well, we want you to change this in the prospectus. It's very similar to that.
Okay.
So we're almost there. We're on the 1 yard line.
Okay.
We're going to get our first issuance, and we're going to deliver and sell those. And when we do, we're going to show the market that actually by doing this, not only is it a much more profitable line of business than our corporate business, it's fully within our control because we're originating the cash flows.
Wow.
So we're going out and originating the purchases. So we keep the full value chain. And it is, it goes from being a 20% margin business to being a highly profitable business.
Okay.
And why do I emphasize that? I want people to buy, obviously, our stock and support us.
For sure.
But it's because I want to invite capital into this $100 billion problem.
For sure.
Now, you mentioned government money. After we designed this business model and we're out there doing all this, I see an email that the Biden administration has put in place an infrastructure bill, and there's $4.7 billion for orphan wells.
Wow. To plug them.
Oh,
my God.
And clearly, like, it's better to be, lucky than good?
Mm-hmm.
We had no idea. There were other players more in the know of what the administration was doing. And I think people have assumed that we knew about that. But we got, like, of the money that was given out in our service territory, we get like 25% of that money.
Yeah.
And that's pretty good on open
huge.
bids.
That's huge.
And so that's billions of dollars that's flowing down to all the states. And you have to be really qualified, safe. It's not easy to just, people ask about moats. You really just can't pitch up with a rig and expect to go win that government money.
Yeah.
You have to have a safety record that's exemplary, all the bonding. You have to be known by the Departments of Environmental Protection.
Yep.
And through our operating subsidiary, Plans at Goodwin, we have all that. And, that's all kudos to their high credibility.
It's a great acquisition then if that was the case.
It's a great
Massive, huge.
acquisition. And it's also what we've done differently with this is as we've been building that business, we buy service companies to expand our footprint. And we always run into the problem that, very often we'll be looking at an acquisition and it'll be an oil field services company.
Okay.
Has like rigs and cement and licenses and everything. But half of their business is going to be fracking and drilling new wells. And we will not do that business.
Yeah.
And, it took a long time for even my own team to be like, really?
I'm sure opportunities were being thrown your way.
Yeah,
for that,
and
right?
that business looks in the short term like it's much more profitable. But our strategic edge is that we're the only services company in the world
In the world?
that turns away open hole work.
Oh my God. Yeah, so
Certainly the only public.
you don't need to dive into that whole pond when you have a pond to yourself almost.
And our pond is considered lower margin,
Okay.
but it's driven by, if you're doing open hole work, you're doing drilling and all that, that's really at the behest of whatever decision the oil company is making.
True.
They want to drill a bunch of wells, business is good.
Yeah.
If times are tough, they're shutting everything down.
True.
We've got drivers that are driven by a steady regulatory need for oil and gas companies to plug the minimum.
Yep.
That's growing at about 15% a year.
Yep.
Government money that's getting doled out now every year for the next 5 years at least.
Yep.
And the big blue sky is if we can be one of the market leaders, and we think we are the leader in high grade carbon offsets for methane abatement, then that's the most profitable business line we do.
For sure.
Because we're originating all those revenues ourselves.
For sure.
So we're not answering to the government making an order or the corporates making an order. We're generating the order.
For sure.
And so,
And there's all those unplugged wells that you mentioned. Who's going to do anything with those? Someone's got to do something, right?
Yeah.
So I would say you're in a much better space. Do you actually, before we get to that, I'm going to recap and you stop me wherever I'm wrong or incorrect. Okay. But I just wanted to recap pretty much the business model for our audience. So carbon credit. Carbon credit is like a permission slip that says this company helped the environment by reducing pollution somewhere. So another company can pollute a little more without making the planet worse overall. Does that make sense?
yeah, except for the second part,
So
is
another
it
company.
necessary?
True.
They're often
So they don't
used-
look at it that way. the
They're often
company.
used as offsets for other activity.
Okay.
But, from our perspective, we're just reducing.
Yes.
met
Maybe from the
leaks.
company's side, they look at it
But
from
it
that
is a
angle.
driver for our companies.
Okay.
Yeah.
So your team finds abandoned oil and gas wells leaking methane, 80 times more harmful, by the way, than CO2. You guys plug those wells, stops the gas from leaking. Once that's done, you measure how much pollution was prevented,
Yeah.
correct? So example, we stopped 1,000 tons of methane from leaking. That number gets turned into a carbon credit, correct? Kind of like a digital coupon for proving that you cleaned up.
You got it.
And companies that are polluting too much, for example, like airlines, maybe factories, companies like that, buy those credits so we can say we're offsetting our emissions by funding other cleanups.
You got it.
Boom. That's pretty solid.
Yeah, you got it. And
Okay.
you summarized it beautifully.
Hope you guys understand that now. So my question is, are you planning to stay in the US or do you want to go worldwide?
So we definitely want to go worldwide. We've actually been surprised at the investor, not just the investor interest globally,
Okay.
but we go to these conferences. We're in the world of sustainability. We straddle two worlds. We're in Houston sometimes,
Yeah.
and we're at the COP conference sometimes.
love
the
it, I
UN,
love it.
UN climate conference, but of course that's what I like to do is straddle worlds. And when we're abroad, we've been offered cleanup jobs in Azerbaijan. We've been offered cleanup jobs in Europe,
Okay.
on the Black Sea,
Wow.
And, it's very clear that the vision of building a business that sees its mission and its markers for excellence, the effective cleanup of the environmental shadow left behind by the hydrocarbon economy, that vision excites a lot of people. And so we see ourselves as a global leader.
Okay.
And right now, we're the only one pursuing this business model as a pure play.
Okay.
I mean, and I
Which
want to emphasize that because it costs us money
yeah,
to not do drilling and fracking,
for sure. Opportunity cost, for sure.
opportunity
Yeah.
cost, but it's well worth it because, we are able to then also think more carefully about our plugging work. And so we're using new data techniques. We're able to do a lot of the stuff that if we were running 10 different product lines,
Well, if you
we
were,
wouldn't be able to improve it.
I think even if you were drilling and doing the fracking as well, like I think the way you have it now in the niche that you're in, on the side that you're in, you guys are the good guys. Does that
Right.
make sense?
Well, we think we are.
And
Yeah.
I would agree. I would agree.
Yeah.
That's well, you're cleaning up, you're helping companies get the credit, you're helping this, you're helping that. So for me, there's all good value from it, right? I think the moment that you might get into something controversial with the fracking, then companies might say, well, you're kind of doing both. So
Well, I believe
know?
that 100% will happen. And, this comes from years of talking to, have been part of the carbon community since 2008.
yep.
I tend to, I'm sort of, you heard the concept of a liminal figure, someone who goes between cultures.
Yep.
I do that. I'm half Lebanese, I'm half Floridian,
Okay.
but I'm also, I love hanging out with the thoroughbred carbon people because their passion
Yeah.
and their details orientation. And I love hanging out with the hardcore, mud in their boots, oil and gas guys
Yeah.
because believe it or not, they have more in common
Really?
than sometimes sort of senior management at any company.
Okay.
They both want to see clean, cheap, environmentally effective energy.
True.
And one of the things that's been a real pleasant surprise for me is, a lot of our employees are coming from the oil patch,
Wow.
and they are super excited about carbon credits. To think that, folks who might ordinarily think carbon credit was a virtue signal from one side of the aisle
Yeah.
are realizing, no, wait a minute. It's a piece of paper like you described
Yeah.
that's going to pay me to clean up something that's affecting my community. So why would I say no?
Yeah. Why do you think that that the term carbon credit got that little bit of controversy, and why do you think so?
Well, that's a long story, probably
Yeah.
with many answers, but there's a few different causes.
Okay.
One is there are, regulation in general, if it's not aligned well with incentives and the way a business actually works,
Yeah.
can be a straitjacket.
Okay.
And I think people instinctively feel like, oh, you're going to put a cap or you're going to put a tax on us, carbon tax. I know you have that here.
Yep. We do.
And people may worry that our carbon markets are purely voluntary. They're two corporates trading with each other,
Yep.
something of value
Okay.
that their investor bases both value. And that's why I like that voluntary carbon market. It's quicker to market. It's more of a free market.
Yeah.
It's lower in cost.
Okay.
Sort of trades $10 to $20 a ton in the voluntary markets traditionally. And the compliance markets, which are like the carbon taxes or the cap and trade programs or the European emissions trading scheme, those credits could be 80 euros a ton. And well, why is that? Because scarcity is brought in by regulatory fiat.
Okay.
My view is like if I would rather solve a big problem like this by finding a way for the capital markets to build it into our ecosystem,
Yes.
because then it'll solve itself. If you try and solve something with some of these other more compliance markets, though they're more profitable, and I get their point, they're not bad,
Yeah.
but I think they're limited because they are, at the end of the day, it's another regulatory driver, which can cause unintended consequences.
For sure.
It's like back to the mortgages.
Yeah.
You incentivize cheaper mortgages,
Yeah.
it led to unintended consequences.
Yeah.
I don't know what those might be for regulatory carbon markets, but
True.
One thing might be that the cost of energy goes through the roof. And to the extent that energy buyers, it's a global market now,
Yeah.
energy buyers want to have low carbon intensity hydrocarbons,
Yeah.
they shouldn't be buying €80 a ton carbon offsets to achieve that. They should be buying from us at $8.
Yeah.
And so to
Okay.
me, that's, that this is the low cost, high efficiency way to get people who, in the environmental side and on the oil field side, they all want to do the right thing.
True.
I do believe they fundamentally do. Humans are difficult. We sometimes trick ourselves, and I'm not naive about, drivers for advantage. But there is something about the fact that we live in this world and we only have one of them
Yeah.
that I do think brings people together on this topic.
Yeah. I think it's like a lot of topics nowadays, right? There's so much good to come from things like the things that you're doing, right? But then there are, bad apples everywhere that take advantage of situations, take advantage of good intention, which is very sad, right? But again, I think more people thinking like you is good, very good for a space like energy. It needs it. It's been it's almost like kind of secretive what happens behind closed doors of the energy industry. Not many people are into it, and it's hard to understand the terms, and it's not really digestible, right? So a lot of average people don't even know what happens behind closed doors of that space, right? So for you to come here and say what you're saying is very refreshing for that space.
No, there is a lot of inside baseball.
I could
You know?
imagine. I could imagine.
And you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And it is a little bit like the Wizard of Oz, though. Once you get behind the curtain,
Yeah.
it's actually a lot more simple
Okay.
than it looks. At least a lot of oil fields are the same as they were 50 years ago,
Yeah.
with small variations.
Yeah.
And so I think huge innovation opportunity, and so we see this business at Zefiro, I think, will be it's not just the carbon credits, not just the cash flow, it's not just plugging $500 billion worth of wells, which is what we want to do,
Yeah.
but it's also building the next gen operational ways of doing it. So we're using the drones and the blockchain and the AI to bring our costs down. We've got 3.7 million wells to survey. Wow. A little company like us.
Yeah.
We already have a model of all 3.7 million.
Wow.
And we're already getting pretty good at estimating which ones are leaking based on satellite data, our own ground truthing, and drone flyovers.
So sometimes you might not even need a person there.
Well, to figure out where the leakers are, yes.
Wow.
So we're developing basically a well leaking oracle that we can use.
So there's tech around this as well.
Oh, big time, yeah.
Wow.
We're using we have a tech that's our field hands will download an app
Okay.
which walks them through all the ways when they're measuring like a leak rate on a well to make sure that everything is being captured, and also they're being reminded that this is going into an audit trail. It's not just, hey, go check if this well is leaking, which is the way it's always been done forever. They write it on a pad, well is leaking.
So high efficiency.
So they're tracked. They have to show their face. They have to then put the serial number of the actual machine,
Okay.
and it has to pull up that it was recently repaired within its warranty, and it's been calibrated this month.
Wow.
And if those dates aren't there, they can't proceed. So we're creating that workflow on the handheld,
Yeah.
and that's
a
really
game
gonna
changer.
allow people to get out there. And then of course, it's one step from that once we've got that down internally
Yeah.
to let third parties who are knowledgeable take training
Okay.
and go out and survey for us.
True.
And
With your standards, pretty much.
yeah, they can download the app, they can get the right equipment from
Okay.
us,
Okay.
and they can be out there. And there's millions of wells to survey. We think it could be a really cool way to engage the community,
Yeah.
and
even-
gives them some money.
How many wells are being like left on a monthly basis? Like, do you know that number? Like,
Yeah, you can look at
because
it.
it's constantly growing, right? So even as you're surveying, there's more coming in.
I was in a meeting last week, and it was one of the states in Appalachia. I don't want to embarrass any state. But
Okay.
it was one of the ones we serve, and they had cleaned up a number of orphan wells last year with federal money, but it was less than 100.
Okay.
And they had added 716 wells so far this year
Okay.
as of the end of February, where the reporting was.
Oh my God. It's a lot. I know you mentioned that, you like being in the space you're in because you have a lot of control over what you do. It's a big market space. We know that. Do you think that there's anything externally that can negatively affect Zefiro? Like maybe carbon credits, whoever's controlling that, is that something that you guys rely on? Because it does seem like, to be honest, it's an amazing business model that has potential for decades and decades to come, right? But my question is like you said, the no sales. What was that? That term, right?
What are the problems with it?
What are the problems, or what are the external factors that could affect this that are out of your control?
Well, there's many things out of our control.
For sure.
There's risk everywhere.
Of course.
One of them is obviously the capital markets have been very poor recently, and we're a public company.
Yeah.
And so, but this too shall pass. We're not singled out.
You're not in the boat alone. Yeah, you're not.
And I would say our big, one of the big worries for innovators is, you got two big worries.
Yeah.
Can you find a market
Yeah.
for your new widget that you're creating?
Yeah.
I was listening to one of your fellow Toronto guys, Jordan Peterson, on
Love him.
like creativity.
Okay.
And he pointed out creative people, they see problems differently.
Mm-hmm.
They create a new solution, and almost by definition, there's no market for it. And so, the good news here is we've solved it in such a way that we're able to leverage off the old market, which is the traditional ways of getting this funded, while we incubate the new market.
True.
And so that has been, a bit of like, the banker in me combined with the vision,
for sure.
the sort of more
I see it.
dreamer in me,
For
right?
sure.
And then the so I think we're well protected from that side,
Yeah.
but that would have been a risk, right? Can we get to market with something really new,
For sure.
and can we get there in time? And then the other big competitive dynamics. Like, all right, okay, so once you prove something works, do you have a patent to protect you? What's going to prevent someone else from jumping in?
Mm-hmm.
And so, the way I think about those risks is, first of all, even if we're successful in our vision to be 10 times our size by 2030 and be plugging 5,000 wells a year,
Yeah.
it's still far less than 5% of that market.
Yeah.
So the market is highly fragmented, with a lot of little mom and pop pluggers,
Really?
and it's a lot of individual people who don't have the benefit of the platform we can give them. So
Of course.
we find people actually like the idea of coming onto our platform,
Okay.
being part of a bigger mission.
Yeah.
But so I think we're protected from that point of view. That there's no one out there that's going to be screaming to get in on this. Partly because as we ramp this up, as we're building the carbon credit market with us.
True.
So by definition, it's immaterially small for Baker Hughes to get into that business.
True. Yeah.
So for us, it's tremendous upside,
Okay.
and we're going to grow into it.
Okay.
So we're not really competing against the big guys. Now, our competitors in the market, though, are a group of companies, some of whom do just the carbon credit processing,
Okay.
and some of who do just the plugging, but they're subdivisions of multi-line OFS businesses, oilfield services.
Okay.
So they're not fully dedicated. That business model will have some success, but I think over time what people will see is because we're single focused, we're able to drive down costs, and it'll be very hard to beat our unit costs for what we do across all three markets that we serve: corporate, government, and carbon credit.
Yeah. You mentioned it. You mentioned the goal that you had. Can you repeat the goal that you have?
Yeah.
Let us know. What's
That was
the
my
what's the
moonshot. My
what's the
moonshot was
2030 goal?
5,000 wells a year. We do 2 to 250 now.
Oh, that's definitely possible. That's
People think it's not possible, and the JP Morgan banker in me cringes, but I know we
no
can.
way. Because there could
I've
be.
walked it through. We can do it.
There could be technically. You correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just looking at it from a business side, but there could be technically just 10 clients that you have that bring you those 5,000.
Yeah, you could.
Right.
It's not impossible.
Right.
And the great thing about it is, I think we will be at that point. I think we'll join the ranks of the environmental services sector more broadly, which includes really big names like, who are the big, Clean Harbors is a very big one. Waste management is probably the big elephant in the room. But those companies, are paid a premium by the markets because they do something we know we need done that has good cash flow characteristics and a good environmental impact. And investors love those companies.
Yeah.
And so as we grow into that
You're going to get
company,
Yeah,
I think people will begin to appreciate our stock.
for sure. You mentioned, the stock market right now. It's a little bit up and down. Let's say.
There's
I'll
volatility.
put it nicely, up and down. What are your thoughts on the market moving forward? Let's say this year. I was reading an article from J.P. Morgan. Actually, they said this year 40% chance of recession. That was noted, I think, last week. What are your thoughts on the market, just as an overall?
Look, I mean, I think market cycles are a fact of life.
Yeah.
I think that we're going through a bit of a commodity price cycle down. Some of
I feel like
that's
we need to, though.
by intent.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that, in terms of the macroeconomics of interest rates and what have you, every time I think I know what's going to happen, another war breaks out
Yeah.
and changes the dynamic.
Yeah,
So geopolitics really plays into that macro story.
for sure.
But as a business, we're positioned intentionally to face that volatility. I mean, we
Okay.
started before Biden came into office
Yeah.
with this vision,
Yeah,
and now Trump's back in,
yeah.
and we're an uncorrelated business.
True.
We're solving a problem that's there regardless of what's happening,
True.
and has sort of an active exigency that's needed to clean this up.
Yeah.
And that's only increasing.
Yeah. So it doesn't even affect you guys, really.
I think, look, we're going to be affected to some degree. It's
Everyone
impossible.
will. It's just the degree to which you're.
But it is, I think we're reasonably well prepared.
I want to ask you more. Now we're gonna transition a little bit more into your background as now a CEO founder, and everything you've done, right? Because we have a lot of audience members that watch this that are in a position that own a business. They want to start a business, and they're all into mindset, right? And I think that you obviously have a very great mindset to get to where you are today. And it's crazy because you're saying the story to me, and I'm kind of putting your past experience together with your story. And I'm saying, oh, he's using this knowledge that he learned. He's using this. And you're kind of like a perfect combo of your experience, literally. Like what you've created between the finance capital world, quantum physics, and science. Like you're really meshing everything you love,
Yeah, it's so fun.
right?
It's so fun, but I didn't have a grand plan
No,
to
but
make those all fit.
I think you were working hard at what you like doing, and opportunities come when that happens. You put yourself in the right rooms, you talk to the right people. That's important.
Well, I tell you what I think was maybe the aligning driver for me.
Yeah.
And now that I use it with all my teams and with myself
Yeah.
is, we've got an investment philosophy on our website. It has 3 pillars. The first one is called, we look for sustainable investment opportunities. People read that and they gloss over, oh, I know all about sustainability. But I don't mean it that way.
Yeah.
Whatever way you thought you meant it, what I mean is, I want to spend a lot of time formulating the problem. I want to make sure that the business we're building or the capital we're deploying is solving a problem profitably that is a really persistent problem that doesn't have a lot of other solutions. So you want to go for the hard problems.
Yeah.
I mean, this problem in oil and gas is a perfect example.
Huge problem.
It's a big pain in the ass problem. None of the existing players, as a result, want to look at it. That creates the opportunity for creative people to have a bit of space to innovate.
For sure.
You got to look for those problems that are sort of persistent value gaps in the economy that aren't being well served.
Yeah.
There's lots of them.
Yeah.
We call that a sustainable investment opportunity. So, one way to say is if you see a place where angels fear to tread, that might be a great business opportunity. So we spend a lot of time on defining the problem. And again, Einstein was famous for saying if you had an hour to solve a problem, you'd take, the first 59 minutes formulating it properly. Once you formulate it properly, you can solve it.
True.
But to move it back to our situation at Zefiro, if you're not willing to actually face that it is a big problem, or that, eventually it's going to blow up on people, you can't even begin measuring to fix it.
True.
And so we try and spend a lot of time on the problem.
Okay.
And so in terms of how it is I bring in my experiences, once we've defined the problem, I can go to my toolkit.
Nice.
I can go, okay, I know what the problem is. Where have I encountered something where I can take my experiences and apply it?
Yeah.
So I'm really honored and flattered that you saw some of those things, but it clusters around the problem-solving exercise.
True. How about risk? Because I feel like you've seen a lot of risk assessment, how to gauge risk, how to make a decision on risk, being at JP Morgan, now doing what you're doing now. Even in the science world and quantum physics, you understand risk in a different way. What have you learned about taking risks? And currently, how do you assess risks? How do you decide how big this risk is going to be or how small this risk is going to be?
It's a great question. Well, I alluded to it before when I had a conversation with that mystery CEO. And I basically, his analysis was he looked at the risk and return payoffs.
Yeah.
And he said, starting a business is more risky, but the payoff is so much larger. It's a risk worth taking.
Yep.
And I do think entrepreneurs, it's something that I think high performers learn how to assess the risks over time. It's dynamic.
It's kind of even like a momentum effect of learning from one risk. Now you know a little bit more about risk. That the next time you're going to make a decision, you're kind of taking into consideration the last risk. So 100%.
Yeah, and then to bring it back to the third of our investment principles on our website at XMC is I call it ontology, but it's basically the study of being.
Okay.
Which sounds very philosophical, and maybe like, what is this doing on a web page about investing? But it's about taking seriously the fact that we live in one world, and it has a logos to it. It has an organizing principle.
Yeah.
And that, when you really sit down and you think about all the things we fight about on how to solve problems, we are living in the same physical space, subject to the same laws of nature. And that helps you ground your problems. And part of that, developing an objective view of your own situation, is talking to people that you trust.
Of course.
And so going back to what you said about, when I polled people who were smarter than me, when you're starting a business, by definition, you're underestimating the risk. So the only way that you can begin to put some reserves and some caveats around how much risk you're actually taking is to get to poll as wide a group of wise people who've had experience, who may be better at perceiving risks than you, and to listen to them. And the biggest thing I see in my teams is what differentiates someone who comes up that curve you're referring to is people who are willing to look at their own ignorance and go, I did not know that.
Accountability.
I did not know that. I need to know that in the future.
Yeah. Do you have a question, or do you have is there something you think about before any big business decision? Is there something you ask yourself?
We hit on one of them, which is, okay, have I learned from all the mistakes I might have made in the last year?
For sure.
And then I try and ask my core team,
Okay.
what are we learning? What are we not good at?
Yeah.
Are we about to double down on something we're not good at?
True.
Okay. And, if so, then we better do it differently.
Yeah.
So it's that willingness to self-reflect. And then the other filter was, when I'm considering whether we're going to make an investment, is it the type of sustainable opportunity that's solving a long-term problem? Because then the problem will stay open long enough for me to find a solution.
True.
Someone else won't just come along. Well, I can fix that.
True.
Oh shit! I built a business and there's an easy solution.
True.
And then the third one, and it's our third pillar, is the way we do it. And this is a little bit, could sound very naive, but I call it cultural accretion. But what I mean by it is, we're in a marketplace. Our company is in a marketplace. Even within our company, all our relationships are a marketplace. There's a give and a take. The relationship dynamic should be win-win as much as possible.
True.
At times, it's not going to be. One person's going to be sacrificing, and the other one's going to be benefiting. But through the cycle, if the way we're doing the business is leaving one group of people or one group of counterparts with the short end of the stick, then I don't think it's the right solution. So it's kind of, what's the type of problem?
Yeah.
What are the risks? And am I being objective about it? And then finally, is the solution we've come up with, does it meet the sniff test of, if it leaves someone else stuck with the problem, it's probably not a solution. It's probably just shifting the problem
Yeah, for sure.
to someone else.
Okay. Let's talk about leadership a little bit, because you've exhibited many great leadership traits throughout this conversation, where one thing is that that you're not the best at everything. So one thing that you've said a lot of times is, we brought this person in because they're very good at that. We brought this person in because they're very good at that. That's one of the main signs of a great leader. And I think that you're giving a lot of other people credit within your business too, which is great. You're giving credit to your mentors. These are all signs of great leaders. What do you think makes you a great leader?
Well, you're the first person who's called me that, so thank you.
I think you can tell from the way someone talks about their team, the people around them, and the importance of them, because you're not just sitting here saying, hey, this is all about me. This is everything I did. You mentioned the people around you many times.
Well, it's a joy
Yeah.
and a joy to build these teams.
Yeah.
And I suppose to me, we're all on a pathway of getting to be better and better leaders. We all have leadership roles in our lives,
Yeah.
whether it's just around the home and raising your kids, and that's a big leadership role,
For sure.
or you have a team of 3 or a team of 3,000, right? And we're all in this journey. And so to me, what makes a great leader is the ability to continue to course correct, to continue to take the time to look at the things where you're underestimating risks, you're not getting it right. It's exhausting. Yeah. At some point you just want to say, look, it's very tempting in the leadership role to just start to think, well, I know what I'm doing and other people need to just do it. And so I think it requires a lot of patience getting up and to the right.
Yeah.
And the grid in my mind is, I want to set high goals for myself, and I want it to be accountable to those goals.
Yeah.
And I want all the people working in my teams to do the same. If you slide back on setting lower goals, then you can be a little bit enabled and mollycoddled. Like, oh, it's okay. We only plugged 250 wells this year. Let's do 300 next year.
Yeah.
No, we got to go for big.
Big. Yeah.
But if we go for big and we don't actually put the scaffolding around the teams that are responsible for that to happen, well, they're going to, bust a gut from the stress.
Yeah.
They need accountability and support and resources.
Yeah.
And so trying to keep everyone functioning at that high impact level where they're aiming at aspirational goals, and also they're able to do it without breaking. And that's a tough balance. That's one key factor of leadership. And then the other one is that, I got my dry mouth here. There's a psychological phenomenon. I think it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, but it's something like that.
Okay.
You can edit it out if it's not.
Okay.
But it basically says that when you're a novice at something, you systematically overestimate your capability.
Wow.
And when you're in the top quartile of something, you tend to systematically underestimate your capability.
Interesting.
And to me, what ties that together, and I'm not an academic anymore, so I can just say stuff
Yeah.
without having to back it up. What ties that together is that people who eventually end up as high performers have developed the ability to check themselves on their own perception of their capabilities.
Yep.
And I think that is key, especially if you want to build an innovation culture.
Yeah.
And innovation is, to me, the exciting thing we get to do in energy for the next 20, 30 years.
Yeah. So that was my next question. The culture that you're trying to build. You mentioned think big. Is that one of your pillars for your culture?
Yeah, high goals, think
Yeah.
big, think transformationally.
Okay. Because no, the culture is super important, right? Like we're learning that about every business now. I think every business is realizing, hey, we need to have some culture here to have people buy in and believe what we're doing. Without that culture, what are you really buying into, right? So talk a little bit about, because it seems like you've done this, for years now. Talk about selling your vision to others. What is some advice that you can give to maybe, a kid in their 20s that's trying to start their first business and maybe sell their mom on the vision, like literally all scales of it. So selling your vision, what advice do you have for anyone watching this?
Wow. Okay, so I do. One of my phrases. There's a. I think it's in the Bible, but it says, "Without faith, it's impossible to please God." So, in a religious context, it means what it means, but abstracting it a bit,
Yeah.
faith is really believing in something that isn't quite there yet.
Yeah.
It's believing in a thing that is about to come, and so belief in the vision, it's impossible to achieve without belief in the vision.
Agreed.
And so I can see some people coming along the pike who really struggle with belief. And belief doesn't mean it's not like any particular set of beliefs, but it's, say we're setting out to go raise a bunch of money.
Yeah.
If you don't fundamentally believe that you can get the check from someone,
Yeah.
then everyone you talk to will know
They'll feel that.
that you don't believe it.
Yeah.
And so I've asked myself, what keeps people from operating in faith of the vision? And I think haven't fully figured it out yet, but I have found that very often people need different pathways to believing in the vision.
Okay.
Pathways that attune to their areas of greatest expertise.
Makes sense.
And so my advice for leaders as you're trying to get people on board with your vision is try to understand kind of where, if the person has a lot of operational background, then you need to help them understand how you can get from A to B operationally. So if I'm going to get to 5,000 wells with my operating teams, it's like, yeah, so let's sit down and figure out how many new rigs do we need to buy each month.
Yep.
And they can see that there's an operational bridge and it's not impossible.
Yes.
That's helpful.
True.
For people who are more conceptually driven, you need to sometimes really keep pointing them back to the really amazing TAM that's there, the addressable market.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a bit of a tailored thing, but when people are failing to really get it done, it's usually because a lack of courage that's happened.
True. Well, it's a thing too. You have to be confident in yourself before others are going to be confident in you, right?
It does come down the chain.
Yeah. So you correct me if I'm wrong again. You raised 50 million.
We've raised and deployed at XMC approximately 55 million. Yeah.
That's amazing. There's a lot of our audience members, they hear raising capital a lot. They hear, I just raised this, I just raised this, I just raised this. And we were actually raising capital for a little bit for our media network. So I actually have a very bad experience with the space. But what do you think about raising capital for smaller businesses? Not so much because obviously you have a monster business in a monster space. What do you think about raising cap for smaller businesses? And if there's again, for our audience out there, a lot of people have thought about this. Hey, I want to raise some cap to do this. I want to raise some cap to do this. What advice would you have for them? Is there a right or wrong time to be doing it? Is there sometimes even no reason to do it? Because even we were told, do you guys even need that capital? And even sometimes we were told, your concept is correct, but you're actually pitching to the wrong investors as well. So there's like a bunch of stuff that I was learning about the market. And I was just like, you know what, man, screw this. I don't want nobody's money, right? So maybe talk a little bit about, for a smaller business, what are your thoughts on raising capital?
Well, first of all, I don't consider myself an expert on the topic.
Of course, but you did raise a solid amount.
Yeah, we have.
Of course.
And look, it's been, but the first capital I ever raised was for our seed round during COVID.
Okay.
After that conversation.
Okay.
And what I've learned is that a number of different things. One is it's far better to have a lot of supporters at small levels than a single big supporter.
Okay.
And this is because you get all their points of view. If you have one person who's got 90% of your cap table, it can distort the opinion matrix.
So almost instead of one guy having 50% of your company, maybe 5 guys or 10 guys with 5, or 5 guys with 10. Okay, cool.
Correct. And you put them in a room together.
Okay.
And get their advice.
Okay.
Getting money from people who have done more than you and have more experience deploying money.
Yeah.
Is really important.
Yeah.
Because you're going to learn from them.
True.
And they're going to be your sanity check on how to spend it.
True.
Another thing I've learned when you're doing early stage capital raise is, think of your cash as essentially an option premium to get you to your next step change of viability.
Okay.
You start with an idea. You got to raise enough capital to get you to, hey, I don't just have an idea, I have a minimum viable product. Then you have a chance to raise more.
True.
But each one of these capital raises is taking you across a journey where you only have so much water in the tank.
Yeah.
And so be really careful about how you spend investor capital.
No one ever talks about that part. Yeah.
What I did was I actually cut my household costs by close to 50% when I took in money.
So you leaned out, actually.
Yeah.
You went leaner.
And the reason I did that was because I then had to raise less capital. And I didn't want to be talking to my investors saying, I burned your capital because, well, I have these expenses.
Yeah.
And they're real, people understand. But what I did was I moved my whole family to Florida.
Good call.
We cut our costs. It's a lower tax jurisdiction. And it's also one of the things I see, if you're willing to do that, it says a lot to your investors, to your family, and even to yourself.
True.
I am doing this.
Yeah. With or without them.
Yeah, so what I see a lot of people get hung up is they might have a nice job at a bank
Yeah.
or a hedge fund. They're making decent
Well, you were that.
cash.
You were that.
Decent cash. They live in a nice suburb.
Yeah.
And well, I really want to start this company. And my answer is, if you're going to do that, you got to cut your burn, move to a lower cost jurisdiction,
Yeah.
and raise less money.
Yeah.
It worked for me. It won't work for everyone.
Of course.
But the reason I think it's a psychological test as well.
For sure.
It's like,
How serious
am
are
I
you?
willing to invest?
Yep.
I'm not showing up with cash, but I can cut my expenses.
Yeah. I'll dedicate my time. I moved my family. These are things that maybe are not tangible, but they mean a lot.
Yes.
So when it came to your investors, were most of them strategic, or was it more for capital, or was it a mix?
Well, I have a really great bench of initial investors.
Okay.
And it's, as I mentioned, one of the, two of them are, right in the mix of two of the largest hedge funds in the world ever.
Amazing.
AQR and
Some good
Bridgewater.
company you're with. Yep.
And it is not the size of the check; it's the time they give me,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But also among the mix are, people who've been chief risk officers of major bulge bracket banks.
Okay.
We have, individuals who've been through large, high-profile corporate bankruptcies and run the whole process.
Wow.
So we have a very highly accomplished investor base, which I think that's best because they understand what I'm trying to do. We understand each other.
Yeah.
If you feel like if you feel in your bones that your investors don't understand what you're doing, you need to try and bridge that gap. Because it could be lazy to think, well, they don't need to understand. They're passive, but it's their money.
Yeah.
And you didn't have it. So you got to make sure they really understand. And when you go the extra mile and you inevitably hit the hiccup that you didn't think you would hit, you've got someone that's there and supportive and willing to flex with you.
True.
And so I'd say high communication to your investors for early stage folks.
And it feels like even your investors, they have their expertise in a certain pillar of your business.
Yes.
Very smart. Very smart. You know, honestly, I think you're going to do amazing things. I really do. I think that what you're doing is super innovative, but you mentioned all the great things about it, you know, helping the environment, helping companies reduce emissions. You're the first company to do this. You know, we don't need open wells across North America. Like, we just don't need that. That's very dangerous, right? And I think I'm super happy to do this podcast because I think more people need to at least be aware of the fact that that's happening, number one. And number two, we have a solution and he's sitting right here, right? So seriously, great work. You have an impressive resume, and I see you using all that experience moving forward. I think you're gonna hit that goal easily of 5,000 a year. I'm gonna say that now. We're gonna come back and clip this part when you hit the 5,000. But I gotta ask you our famous question: does money buy happiness?
Does money buy happiness? So this kind of is a great time to ask me the question. Does money buy happiness? Of course, intuitively, we all think, well, of course not, right? And you can answer the question in a lot of ways. I'm sure you've got other people with great answers. Here's how I think about it. When I started the business, you know, I think like a lot of people, I'd been through seasons of life where expenses were high. I had a mortgage to meet. I had credit card debt, you know, because this thing got to get paid for the kids.
Yeah.
And at that time, you just feel paralyzed of, you know, man, I need more money. And that's a common human experience.
It's a shitty thing to feel. Yeah.
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 And almost everyone goes
sure,
through that at some time. And what I then encountered, though, when I was raising money was I started meeting people who were sitting on piles of money,
Yeah.
who psychologically were feeling the same anguish.
Wow.
One guy in particular, you know, he's well, I have $10 million in my trust fund, but, you know, I just don't even know how I'm going to get by. You know, I'm barely 50, and I just thought, now that I didn't expect.
Yeah.
And again, I backed up from it and I realized that having too little money and a lot of debt, you feel paralyzed and you have no flexibility. He was feeling paralyzed and flexibility in his life, and he couldn't be creative because he was thinking, I have to save this $10 million.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't let it get eaten away by inflation,
Yeah.
but I don't want to take risks.
Scarcity mindset.
And so
Yeah.
what I've concluded is that, you know, people talk about money, you know, it's supposed to be what? Medium of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account. If you've been involved in the Bitcoin world, you'll hear that a lot.
Yeah.
But that's coming from classical economics. I'm not so sure about the store of value and unit of account. I get it. I think in my mind, medium of exchange is the core value of money. It is a way that grown-ups have of actually expressing trust to one another. If I give you money for a business, for a service you're going to give me, or a business you're going to build, we're establishing a relationship.
Yep.
And so I see money very personally that way,
Okay.
and it can deepen relationships. And I found that raising money, I got to have some friends and some, you know, like a lot of times as a grown-up, you think you're never going to meet people who are going to feel close as your childhood friends. But I've gotten to have real friends through taking financial risks with them, investing their money, hiring them, watching them make sacrifices, watching them raise money. And so to me, the joy of money and where it can give you a lot of happiness is in how you use it to mediate good relationships. And that's not meant to be outside the box of financial returns. That's the way that money works.
Okay.
It is a unit account. It is a store of value. But I'm in it for the relationships and the change I can bring about. in the ring.
Yeah.
The units account store of value I'll let other people worry about.
Listen, there's probably nothing more fulfilling and of a bond with someone than making money with them. You know, it's a great thing when you like me and my business partner. We always feel this way
Isn't
with
it
each other.
cool?
It's the best. You know, like obviously there's a lot of downsides sometimes. Sometimes you lose money together, right? But you're learning together. Even in the negative side, you're still learning together. Where that you're gonna come across it again, then you're both just like, no, we're not doing that again, right? So
Totally.
relationships and making money together. I don't think we've got that answer before. Great
Good.
answer.
I gave
Something
some new,
unique.
some
I
new
love it.
grist for the mill.
I love it. Listen, thank you for coming. I wish you and Zefiro the best. I think you guys are gonna crush it. I'll put all the links below, guys. Check it out on the stock market. I'll have their website as well and all information on Doctor here. All right. Thank you for tuning in, guys. Appreciate your time, my man. Thank you.
you.
All the
It's an
best.
honor.
Of course. We'll see you guys later. Ciao.